Thank you for your time. I'm sorry for the technical problems. The class is met for 3 weeks. We have more people joining us this morning, excited by the prospect to hear you in person. I've introduced you in the past, but I just want to say that, as I've said to the class, Rabbi Yitz Greenberg is one of the most important thinkers in the Jewish world for the past 50 years, but also has had a life of activism. He's also been an important mentor to me, and I appreciate all that you've done for me over my career and for the generous giving of your time this morning. Let me start by asking the following question. There are many books that make the case for Jewish survival and other books that outline the core values of the Jewish religion. You chose to write a book that speaks to both Jewish survival and Jewish values, but your framework is theology. Why did you choose that approach?
By the way, let me just say, number one is that you have been one of the most fulfilling and important relationships in my work with the rabbinate. I was going to say it later, but I can say it now. One of the central parts of my career has been this conviction that's a turning point in Jewish history, partly because it's the post-Holocaust and partly because America opened up and Jews had a challenge of choice and freedom as never before. Anyway, my point is, my reaction was that we need new institutions to deal with these choices we never had before, and we need new thinking. And that has been a central part of my own career. But what attracted me to you and what impressed me in the same way was that you had the same sense, both of the need for new institutions, and you were an entrepreneur, and a response that this was a very special time. So it's been a personal relationship, but it's the one that grew also out of a deep affinity for the values and for the thinking. I'll say one more thing before I go on, which is I'm happy to stay later. Since we lost a half hour, I'm happy to stay on if the audience is, and I thank them for their patience. If you'll give me one more minute, I'll tell you, this is when I started Klal, it's based, can you hear me? It's based on a Nachman of Bratslav story. He has a great story called The Great Light and the Lesser Light. And the long and the short of it is that is this young man who's the son of one of the most brilliant opponents of Chassidut. And he is attracted to this new Hasidic Rebbe, and his father is firmly against it. So his son keeps trying, and he gets sick because he can't go, and he tries. And 3 times they try, they go to visit the Rebbe. And each time there's a massive interruption. The bridge breaks down, horses run away. So of course at the end, he never gets to the Rebbe, and in fact he dies of longing and of sorrow. And then the father goes to visit the Rebbe, and the Rebbe, this time he gets to the Rebbe, and in sitting, waiting to get in, sitting next to this man, the man that turns out to be the devil. And the devil says to him, you can now go see the Rebbe, because I had to stop the sun, because if the sun and the Rebbe met there, the later light and the aggressor light, the Messiah would have come. So now that I've stopped that, you can go visit him. I tell that story because with the difficulty of starting a program is a sign of how important it is, the devil. So, in fact, when we started Klal, literally everything went wrong, including a massive snowstorm, and Elie Wiesel, who was the main speaker, on his train, the train stopped because of the snowdrifts, and he ended up having to walk for 2 hours. Anyway, so all I'm saying is, this must be a very important program because the devil has done a very good job of doing it. Okay, sorry. On with your program.
Well, to follow up on the question about theology, I really want to push you on why you chose theology.
Oh, yes. Okay.
Let me just add to this. In surveys of Americans, only 26% of Jews believe in a God as described in the Bible. compared to 56% of the general population and 80% of identifying Christians. When God is defined as a, quote, spiritual force or a, quote, higher power, the Jewish affirmation jumps to 75%, but that is still well under the 90% of Americans who would say yes to that second framing. So how do you understand this God gap in the belief patterns of American Jews? And to restate my first question, why did you choose a theological approach to make the case for Jewish survival and Jewish values?
So with your permission, I'll answer this first theology question first, and we'll come back to the God question second. The first question, the truth is, I don't really see it as theology. In other words, if you think theology means talking about God, it's not. What I'm really about, when I think the book is about meaning or making meaning. If people would ask me, are you a theologian? I'd say, no, I'm a meaning maker or a meaning interpreter. I think in every period of Jewish history, there were a group of people who played this key role, communicating the values, and Judaism is a values and a meaningful way of living life. And so in every generation, I think in the early biblical period, it was the priests. In the middle period, it was the prophets who gave you both the values and the way to live a meaningful life. And of course, one of their greatest teachings was that God does not want ritual and gifts. God wants human heart and ethical behavior and justice and taking care of his creatures. After the prophets, there was the rabbis who offered the interpretation. And I think, again, they had to give an answer in a world in which God was not all-powerful, in which I believe the covenant between Jews and God was dominant, but the Jews, the individual human beings, had to play a larger role. So my answer is, we're living in a time, I believe, where God, we'll come back to that, I hope. God is most hidden. God is most present to the rabbis when God is most hidden. So it's easy when God is hidden to say, I don't have a belief in God of the Bible, or I don't have a belief in God. But the deeper truth is that we need meaning, and we're searching for meaning. And I consider the book an attempt to respond to that question. I didn't invent those values. I'm trying to filter and bring them forward from the interaction of the lens I have from the modern culture and from the tradition that I have from the Jewish tradition, and filter through them so that we get the best values and the most meaningful way of living.
Nice. So I'm going to read you a passage from your book, and then I'm going to read you another excerpt and ask you to comment on it. In chapter 1 of your book, you write the following: Jewish religion teaches that although the Creator is not perceptible to our senses, we can detect and connect to the divine. We can intuit and explore dimensions of reality that elude physical detection and measurement. Now, in our first class, when I read your passage, my mind jumped to a classic reading that was written by Mordechai Kaplan that appeared both in the original 1945 Reconstructionist Shabbat prayer book and also made its way into the 1994 Kol Neshama Siddur that we use here at Adat Shalom. And I'll just read you a few short parts of that passage and ask you to compare what you wrote to what Kaplan wrote almost 100 years ago. God is the mystery of life, enkindling inert matter with inner drive and purpose. God is in the faith by which we overcome the fear of loneliness, of helplessness, of failure, and of death. God is in the hope, which, like a shaft of life, cleaves the dark abysms of sin, of suffering, and of despair. God is in the love, which creates, protects, forgives. Now, one person in class accused me of making up the connection between what you were writing and what Kaplan was writing, but I'm curious to get your observation about what you were saying in your first chapter about God and what Kaplan was trying to say.
Well, don't forget, in a sense, Kaplan and I are both responding to the reality out there. The reality out there is unlike the Bible, when they have these visions of God or they hear voices from heaven, we don't have that experience. So in part, the honest answer is that Kaplan and I are responding and taking seriously the condition under which we have religious experiences, which don't have these visible and voices from heaven, etc. Second comment is, I read Mordechai Kaplan, and it could be he has influenced my thinking. That's the second answer to the question. And thirdly, I would say the main difference perhaps between us in that sense, I mean, I find Kaplan challenging and meaningful and thoughtful. And yes, he was ahead of his generation in willingness to admit the natural, or the supernatural rather, was less and less available. The difference between us is that I concluded that Kaplan is too much of a modernist, meaning he seemed to completely rule out anything beyond the natural or the physical or the measurable. And I think there are like layers or depths of reality. Yes, so on one level of the surface, you might call it, physical level, God is neither available nor seeable nor measurable, nor do we hear voices. But I also believe that there are deeper levels of living and of life. And if you can go to a deeper level, there you will intuit or hear or experience the presence of the divine or the divine dimension of living. So I would say that while there's a parallel to Kaplan, there's a fundamental difference. I can only add one comment to that, and that is, I felt that when Art Green became the head of the Reconstructionist Rabbinical Seminary, that he indeed brought that dimension that Kaplan lacked to the story. It's a neo-Hasidic. There's again a religious experiential dimension. Let me put it one other way. In the initial modernity, there's no room for the alternative truth. There's a science truth, there's a naturalist truth, and all this other stuff is either superstition or imagination or whatever. What we learned, I think, in the postmodern is that there are multiple truths and multiple experiences and multiple layers, I think, of meaning. So my answer is, where I differ from Kaplan is this search or the experience of multiple layers of meaning.
Nice. I'm going to talk now an area called God and History in my headings. I should add, by the way, that my questions were informed by close to 100 questions that were submitted by members of the class. We took 10 minutes at the end of every class for people to send in or pass up to me index cards of things they would like to ask you if you were in the room. And I've tried to kind of consolidate all those into these three headings, which I shared with you a couple of days ago. So there were many questions about the nature of God and what you actually believe. Throughout the book, you alternate between two very different kinds of formulations. You have many passages that are consistent with liberal Jewish theology, things like continuous revelation as opposed to Torah b'Sinai, the Torah given at Mount Sinai. Another example is finding God by turning inward and not by imagining the sky God of the Bible. A third example is when you use God as a metaphor for life-giving forces in the world. And then often on the very same page, your theology is more traditional and consistent with the pre-modern rabbinic tradition. You speak of a personal God who has consciousness and who decides when to intervene in history and in human affairs and when to back off, engaging in tzimtzum, the rabbinic notion of God's willful withdrawal from the world. So what I would say is that the former position was well received by many members of our class. The latter position would be well received by a class of rabbinical students at Yeshiva University. Do you subscribe to both? And if you do, how do you reconcile these two positions?
You caught me out, but of course, I'll start by saying this is conscious. I really want to write a narrative or a theology, I said meaning, for the whole Jewish people. In other words, I started as an Orthodox Jew. I still practice as an Orthodox Jew, but I became a pluralist, and from many experiences, including meeting outstanding rabbis like Sid Schwartz and the non-Orthodox communities. But I became a pluralist. So having said that, the honest answer is I wanted to write this book in a way that speaks to the whole range of the Jewish people. And there is a range of Jewish people who, if they don't hear anything of the tradition, will not listen. There's a whole range of people who are, when they hear the tradition, they won't listen. So it's a tension. I want to speak to both. What do I do? So my answer is personally, now it's not a pure trick. My answer was to write it precisely in its ambiguity, in these, if you will, in multiple layers, so that there's a phrase in Hebrew, Maven Yovan, those who understand will understand. So in a sense, I felt each reader, depending on their background and their spectrum, will see or identify and hear based on that element, whereas others will hear from the other element. What I'm trying to do is get people to widen. Say all ideas, they're not one point. They're a spectrum. They cover a spectrum. In fact, many ideas are very good over part of the spectrum and they become destructive or negative at other parts of the spectrum. I'm trying to tell people, widen your spectrum wherever you are on this spectrum, traditional, naturalist, and so on, widen to hear and to learn from the rest of the spectrum. But in the meantime, in order to reach both, I am, to some extent, deliberately ambiguous and evoking both in the hope that people will be able to hear from both sides of the of the spectrum. I will add that it's not purely a trick. It's because part of my thesis and my theology is that God has not withdrawn, as you said it before, but rather in the biblical God, out of the covenantal relationship to the Jewish people, the biblical God, who is dominant, visible miracles, highly interventionist and controlling, self-limits, asking humans, it's like when you love somebody, you limit yourself, asking the loved one to step up, asking humans to take on more. So here's the paradox. It's not that God is withdrawn, it's that God is hidden. Actually, the great teaching of the rabbis is that when God is hidden, God is actually closer. But in order to hear it, it's not coming from heaven, then you have to go inward, or you have to listen to other people, or you have to look for religious experiences in life itself. So that is partly what drove me, and maybe why I didn't join Mordecai Kaplan. I had experiences that made me feel that I was connected to, or that we in the world are connected to a higher power, to a spiritual force, to a fundamental ground of being, if you want to call it that. I had those experiences, and that gave me the strength, you might say, to resist becoming completely modernized. And as I say, in the postmodern period, there is this recognition that it is possible to have non-rational, non-material, non-measurable experiences. What about you? What about you, Sid? Have you never had a spiritual experience that made you feel that there's a power out there beyond you?
I have made numerous public apologies to this community as my theology changed over time. So I'm well aware of the journey. What's interesting is that at various points in the course, when we saw these two explanations of God or two formulations, which seemed so different, I speculated that this might have been a strategy you were using to reach more and a wider audience. But it begs the question about what does Rabbi Yitz Greenberg believe himself? And I'm not sure, maybe you want to be hidden as well as a Kadosh Baruch Hu wants to be hidden, but it's something that I'm quite curious about. I'm wondering whether you want to weigh in terms of where you come between those two poles.
You know, when I encountered the Holocaust the first time in 1961, I was 28 years old. I was a very happy, fulfilled, observant, learned Orthodox rabbi. And then, of course, my wife and I was an American historian also on the side. That was my career, was an American historian. In 61, I discovered the Holocaust when I was in Israel. It was devastating. And the truth is, there were days, there were weeks, when I really couldn't believe, I couldn't reconcile a loving presence of God and so on, or a God who shapes history, and see what was happening, what was done to the Jewish people, and God seemingly did not intervene or stop it in any way. So the truth is, there were days, I mean, I called it moment faith. There were days, and particularly days when I experienced Israel and the life of the Jewish people, when I experienced the return, Kibbutz Galiot, the return of Jews from all over the world, which the prophets had predicted. And I was living through Jeremiah's promise that the streets of Jerusalem will be full of sound of laughter and joy and bride and groom. When I had those experiences, I really felt the divine presence. And in other times, when I read and I experienced vicariously, in Auschwitz in 1944, that they burnt Jewish children alive. They wanted to save the money to cost the gas to gas these children. So they just threw them into the pit directly. In that moment, when you confront a burning child with nothing, then it's very hard to believe. And so I wrote about moment faith. And again, Michael Wishergrad was a good friend, Orthodox friend. So you can't believe in God on Sunday, Tuesday, and Thursday, and on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. You don't believe in God. I said, says you. I'm telling you, what's the experience? The experience is sometimes the flames, the smoke of Birkenau choke you to the point where you really don't experience. So you can say the words maybe. And by the way, so my point was, it would be, where do you stand? The answer is, it's now 60 plus years since then, and I've been up and down. And I must say, over the years, I have come a little more, not partly by this movement, by this belief that God and the covenant shifts presence and connection. So I'm in the first stage of reaction. Literally, there were days or weeks when I was believing and days or weeks when I was not believing. Then, as the time went on, I wrestled with it continuously. I did come to feel more often or more deeply that sense of presence and connection, and that to see the divine side of beauty and value and power of life. So the answer is that has become a more dominant personal side of it, which doesn't mean that some days. So again, the honest answer, I'm tempted to say, today I believe 82%. Yesterday I believe 35%. Tomorrow will be 91%. This Shabbat it'll be, 98. So I do think that that's true about religion and faith, and I've tried to say that in my writing, that it's not a steady state, and the relationship to God is not a steady state. It is dynamic, changing, and in reality, there are times when I feel, most of the time, I feel God's love and God's relationship. There are times when I'm furious at God, when I think of some of these scenes in my own experience, or how about when we had our own personal tragedy of the death of a child and an accident. So again, I don't want to say I felt anger, but it was really like a knife to the heart, and it was really a barrier. And interesting, by the way, Isaiah the prophet says that death is a barrier. Death is a screen. And that even when, in his time, he said, when we see God, it's like seeing God through a screen rather than directly. And he predicts we'll overcome death. That's in the book. And when death is overcome, then you'll have experience of God directly.
Nice. When I was reading the book, I kept having the names of major Jewish theologians pop into my head saying, this sounds like X, this sounds like B. Franz Rosenzweig, Abraham Joshua Heschel, you mentioned earlier, you read Kaplan, you were familiar with Art Green. As a footnote geek, I was a little frustrated that when you mentioned these ideas, you weren't footnoting in any way. So there's a curiosity that came from the class about which liberal theologians have you read and or studied with and who've had the most influence on you? I'd be curious to know that.
It's hard to give a firm answer to that question. I would say that I read Rosenzweig late, actually, and Heschel late. Earlier, the first, and perhaps to this day, perhaps the most powerful impact of liberal theologians, the Economowalk Reform Group that met, and of course they included Rav Zalman Schachter Shlomi, who doesn't exactly fit the reform model, but they met and they also had an existentialist approach to God. In other words, they moved beyond the modern rational, cool version. People like Dudley Weinberg and Herman Schaumann and Arnold Wolf and Gene Borowitz. Now, number one is just meeting them and seeing the serious, profoundly religious, ethical, religious models had a very powerful effect on me because, as I say, it broke me out of my. After the Holocaust, I no longer felt that I could just be an Orthodox Jew. I felt that the whole Jewish people was attacked because the whole Jewish people carries the Jewish message. So, but meeting non-Orthodox, really quality religious people who inspired me, that broke me out of my cave, out of my prison, and made me into a pluralist. But the other second thing they contributed, and I guess Gene deserves the most credit for this, they talked a lot about covenant. Now, I had a feeling about covenant too, in part I had come across it in hearing Rabbi Soloveitchik's lectures, and in part because of my studies, and in part because of David Hartman, who was a very strong personal friend and influence. So I was open to it, but hearing it from them sort of made me realize, again, this is an important idea that has to be more seriously studied. And so I'd say, whether or not I took specific ideas from them about covenant, the idea of covenant itself and exploring it, and the more I explored it, it's been 60 years, the more ideas and more dimensions have come out of it. So I give them a particular credit and influence. From Heschel, I learned again the significance of religious experience. And yes, one of your questions was narrative theology. I turned to narrative, telling stories, in part because Heschel, too, I felt he didn't offer an intellectual proof. He didn't offer a rational argument for God. He gave a kind of a religious, evocative narrative experience. And so I interpreted that and applied it to the tradition. That's why the Torah's Bible is full of stories. The stories are not a rational, philosophical, structured argument for God, but they give you the experience of encounter and presence. So I would say that is the second factor I got from Heschel, was a greater sense of experiential. And of course, I'm sure he got it from his Hasidic background. Rosenzweig read late, and the ideas of creation, revelation and covenant, relation and redemption are very much borrowed from or influenced by his thinking, except that for the middle term, creation and redemption, meaning that God is the creator, and redemption, the Jewish promise that this world can be turned and improved, tikkun olam, to the point of a paradise. I give Rosenzweig credit certainly for the terminology, but for my middle term, rather than revelation, I use covenant. And one sentence, elevator speech about Judaism. This is a creation. It's a created by. It has a creator, and that creator is the ground of existence. But this creation is full of flaws and imperfection. And Jewish tradition says it can be improved, repaired, tikkun olam. It can be and will be repaired. That's the messianic vision, that this world turned into a paradise, into a Garden of Eden again. But it will not be done by God in a miraculous form. It will not be done by human secular activity alone, but by this partnership between God and humans. So I think that I feel I owe to Soloveitchik, Hartman, Borowitz, and a few others who particularly draw the covenant idea for me or underscored its importance. And again, the other thing I'll say in my self-defense, I listen. I've always enjoyed listening and learning from other people and not just hear myself talk. So I would say I'm sure there are many liberal theologians who have influenced me, just as there have been many traditional theologians, because I read them. And Maimonides has this famous line, accept the truth from whoever gives it, whoever it comes. And I have learned to do that. To hear truth sometimes even from somebody that I dislike or disrespect or think is wrong, but nevertheless they may have a germ or a kernel of truth that's worth hearing. So I'm sure there are many kernels in my thinking that are a result of hearing other people.
Yeah, very helpful. Actually, some of your comments now segue to my next question, but I just want to say one of the names that you mentioned that not everyone may be familiar with is Dr. Eugene Borowitz, who was a professor at Hebrew Union College for many years, wrote theology, and I think people know who Heschel is and Rosenzweig, Soloveitchik for sure, but Eugene Borowitz may be less familiar to our audience. I just wanted to say that. So takes me to my next question. Yes, one of your most seminal teachings is to divide Jewish history into three eras and to suggest that in the third era, the modern period, God has decided to be less directly involved in human history. You argue that humanity has now moved from being God's partner to being the senior partner in the relationship. Thus, human beings have greater agency and, by extension, more responsibility for the moral direction of the world. What many in our class found confusing or perplexing is your suggestion that God came to this realization and changed strategy vis-a-vis humanity and history. Essentially, this is a quote from your book. The divine chose this new tzimtzum, withdrawal, because God wants humans to take power and more responsibility to achieve tikkun olam.
Right.
I think it's fair to say that most participants in our class would agree about the importance of each person taking greater responsibility for the moral arc of the world that we inhabit. But very few would hold the view that human agency is a function of God deciding to give us the keys to the car while God is happy to be going along for the ride in the passenger seat.
Well, first of all, again, I do consider that one of the more important ideas I developed in my lifetime, and I consider it relevant. Again, why? I'm taking the tradition, I mean, that's my Orthodox background, maybe. I'm taking the Bible seriously, that they had these experiences, that Jews had the experience of hearing voices either from heaven or through prophecy, and that he's moved them. Take them seriously. Take seriously the rabbis' experiences where they don't hear those voices anymore, but you will call the famous rabbinic story that a voice from heaven tries to defend the position or validate the position of Rabbi Eliezer and Hyrcanus, and the rabbis say, no, it says in the Torah that the Torah is no longer in the heaven. And I think that I came to see that that's not just a lovely metaphor. It really shows a development. That's, if you explain the difference in rabbinic tradition and the Torah, I think that's the main difference, that they don't hear voices in the same way, but they do interpret, and they, if you will, so I came to conclude, I consider that contribution, that the divine is learning. Bradley Artson, who was a conservative rabbi who told me after I first talked to him about it, he said, well, that's process theology. So yes, I said, I do believe that God is learning. You can see that in the Torah already. God is a perfectionist, and when the humans misbehave, according to the Bible's early story, brings the great flood. But after the flood, God swears never to do that again and to uphold the laws of nature and so on. And that, to me, is the turning point of covenant, where the divine moves from total control, domineering, perfectionism, do it or it's my way or the highway, and if you don't listen, I'll drown you, to a God who says, I will work with you, I will partner with you, I accept humans. That's the key. Covenant is based on the fact that the divine accepts human nature with its flaws and decides that if you demand people being perfection all the time, you'll have to kill them all. You can't do that. If you accept human dignity and human value, then you have to allow them to make mistakes, and then you work with them. You don't give up your ideal, you don't give up your values, but you work with them. You give them tshuva, you give them a chance to repent. Now, the other I have to stress this now. My claim, and this is my original, if you will, my claim is that what the rabbis described, a divine self-limitation, so it's not withdrawal, it's self-limitation, happens a third time in the modern period. And it's a message that not just Jews got, the whole world got. The message of modernity was to humans, don't wait for a divine redeemer, don't wait for a Messiah, take power and perfect the world. And that was the great promise of modernity, and they achieved amazing things. Take power and capitalism will overcome poverty. Take power and medicine will cure diseases. Take power, etc. All these messianic dreams, overcoming hunger, overcoming war, beat the swords and the plowshares. Modernity said you can do it if humans get together and do it. That was its promise. I claim that is modernity is the catching the message from the divine. Wasn't broadcast in smoke-written letters in the sky by a plane. It wasn't broadcast visibly, but humans detected it, just as the rabbis detected it in their experience. My claim is we're living in the third era when God is totally hidden. But here I got to stress again, God is not withdrawn. The rabbis taught me that the God who is hidden is actually closer. The term Shekhinah in the rabbis, it's not in the Torah at all. It's a Mishkan where God is close. But Shekhinah, God as a loving, close, maternal, if you will forgive that sexist comment, maternal, personal God is present more than in the biblical period, even though God is more hidden. That's what a bracha is about. A bracha brings out, a blessing brings out that when you eat this apple, it's not just eating an apple. There's a divine creativity in life, in an apple, in trees, and you're experiencing that as you eat the apple. So I came to the argument that in the third era, God is totally hidden. That means God is totally present. So, and again, I was driven to this by the Holocaust. My answer was, I asked it for many years, where was God in the Holocaust? Because I expected God to save. And God, I didn't save 6 million for sure. But when I said, where is God? I came to realize the message is God becomes more and more hidden, more and more present, but works through humans. In the third phase, God makes more miracles than ever before, but only through natural law and human agency. So if you look at the Holocaust, the truth is human agency was everything. What do I mean by that? I mean, in the Holocaust, the Nazis were out to kill all the Jews. And the Jews had no power. They did their best to stay alive. They did their best to live. They did their best to escape. They were not given much help. But what accounts for the fact that in Denmark, 95% of the Jews were saved? What accounts for the fact that all the Bulgarian Jews were saved? What accounts for the fact that in Albania, Jews were saved? The answer is the neighbors, the bystanders, the allies intervened. Where the neighbors stood by the Jews. In the case of Denmark, they not only protected them and hid them, but they brought them to Sweden and they arranged for their asylum when the Nazis were trying to capture them. So where the neighbors stood up for the Jews, where the neighbors helped, Jews were saved. Where Roosevelt appointed a refugee board, they saved several 100,000 Jews. Where he did not, where he stood by, where the Allies did not make any serious attempt to bomb the rail runs to Auschwitz or to do anything to stop the process, 90% died. In Lithuania and Poland, where the local population was highly anti-Semitic, 95% died because they helped the Nazis. And so my point is, I came to the conclusion that this is, where was God in the Holocaust? The answer is, God was where you'd expect God to be, who's so close. God was in the gas chambers. God was in the ghettos. God was in the suffering. God was present, and suffering as a divine, unlimited, infinite consciousness can only suffer. Can you imagine how much We, with our finite consciousness, suffer when we lose the love of our life, or we lose the dear one. All the more so, God multiplied a thousandfold. But why didn't God save? The answer is because by then, again, if God would ask my opinion, God would say, I would have appreciated it. But my answer is that the divine had passed this responsibility. I use that language, senior partner. I apologize later for it. I think it was the wrong language. It's managing partner is what we're talking about. Managing partner. And God is not along for the ride. God is in the warp and woof of existence. God is sustaining existence. God is experiencing. So I do think it's more than just a Spinoza or Kaplanian nature that God represents. It also represents that, but it represents a God who is sharing, who has again, we're using human language, so I don't take it literally, but I think metaphorically or emotionally, that's what it's saying. It's saying that God has a consciousness that includes knowledge of me, of every individual, has a relationship of love to all. It says we say it in the prayers. God is good to all because God's rachamim, God's mercy, God's mother love is on all God's creatures. So there's a truth there, I believe. Anyway, that's a truth that I'm trying to call attention to, or I've had experiences. And again, I'm not denying that I've had experiences of God's absence and of God's failures, but we live with those qualifications. That it's part of a human experience, and we do the best we can with what we have.
Yeah. Yes, you're dropping so many gems here. I'm trying to, both hold, digest them, and also keep to my list of questions. I just want to raise up the way you just described the seeming paradox between God's seeming hiddenness, but saying that doesn't mean that God is not close, is actually something that I want to sit with a lot longer. It's very poignant and deep.
No,
and
but this
explains
is
a lot of what you've been writing about. Yes.
This is the liberal insight. Of course, it's not just liberal, about God's immanence. That God is when God stops me. But there's a very I liked it very much. Richard Elliott Friedman has a book called The Disappearance of God, and he points out it in the Bible is a movement already from the visible, domineering, controlling, visible miracle-making God. Less and less of that as you go into the Bible, and he argues that by the time you get to the prophetic tradition, God no longer does those kinds of visible miracles, and that's a conscious thing. And he, as a Bible critic, admits that this follows the pattern of the traditional texts, not necessarily the way the critical dating of these texts are, but he sees in the traditional text this movement from the God who controlling dominant to the God who is present, who is communicating, but is no longer totally controlling. In the Bible, if you satisfy God, God will destroy your enemies. Gideon is told by God to fight the Midianites and free the Jews. He comes with several thousand soldiers. God tells him, or the divine voice, send home all but 400, 800. Why? Because God is going to do this. And it's not the soldiers, it's God. But that's over. That's not the way it works. And when you look at the rabbis follow the prophets in saying that the Bible tells us that the first temple was destroyed because of the sins of the Jews. Idolatry, murder, sexual perversion. But the second temple, they admit themselves that they were righteous, they were observant. The whole revolt against Rome was because they wanted to get the idolaters out of the temple. So why did they lose? In the biblical story, God should have split the Mediterranean Sea and drowned the Romans. But God didn't do that. So the rabbi's answer is not that God doesn't care. This is a shift in the divine personality and relationship to humans. God is self-controlled and says humans' behavior will make a bigger difference in the outcome. So the rabbis explain the sins of the second temple because one Jew persecuted another Kamsa bar Kamsa in jealousy and anger, he turned to the Romans, instigated the Romans. When the Romans want to send a sacrifice, a rabbi, Zechariah ben Avkilos, instead of understanding the wisdom of accepting this sacrifice, so the Romans will be pacified, insisted on the letter of the law that this Roman sacrifice had a flaw which made it unacceptable. He wouldn't let them send the sacrifice, so the Romans were outraged. And he goes on and on. The zealots burnt the stores of food. In other words, human misbehavior, human recklessness brought on the destruction of some. So you already see this shift. And I'm saying we're now living in the maximum shift. The danger of the maximum shift is obvious, and you pick it up. If humans are fully responsible, it's so easy to say, well, there's no God. It's all about me. The problem with that, of course, is my answer is it's like a plant taken out of its ground and it turns destructive. It turns poisonous. When these humans who think they are God, they are the masters of the laws of the universe, they end up abusing environment. They end up totalitarian destruction, dictatorships. In other words, here again, I'm saying you don't see it by rational, you see it by behavior. You see that the pathologies, modernity has done marvelous things, pluralism and tolerance and life-saving medicine and overcoming poverty. Billions have been taken from poverty to dignity. But having said that, when it's out of control, when it doesn't know its own limits, it turns into global warming and it turns into inequality of humans in position and so on. So I'm saying again, we have to read history here with the sensitivity of the Jewish claim that God is present even when you don't see it, and it shows up that those humans who understand that presence understand their limits. They're not the lords of the universe, and they understand they have to treat the creation with respect and control and limit. And if they don't, if they think they're the masters of the universe, they ended up abusing that universe. So I think in a sense, again, I'm trying to be in part an empiricist, showing that in history, the experiences give us reason to believe that we are in the presence of a force, of a partner, of a loving presence, and not just in an empty, empty, cold, frozen world in which, again, the existentialists, I admire them, say we have to create values. I'm not saying secular people have no values. We have to create values. But what Judaism is teaching us is that we have full responsibility like a secularist, but we have a full presence of a partner and of a loving accompanist that affects our behavior, that shapes our behavior.
Yeah, I want to pick up on a phrase you used to ask one last question about God, but I want to ask you if we give a brief answer because I want to make sure we have time for the last section on Israel and the third era, okay?
Okay.
So when you talk about God consciousness, I think this is where there may be a distinction we need to make about where liberal Judaism is going. Your characterization of Kaplan's theology is correct for its time, but most of Reconstructionist practice today in Reconstruction congregations where I've had a chance to visit, and certainly our own community at Da'at Shalom, is actually deeply spiritual, probably more influenced by Art Green's approach to God than by Mordecai Kaplan's framing. So I think it's important that people, especially in the more traditional community where you spend a lot of your time, understand that Reconstructionists have not cast out spirituality. They reframe God, but some of the most spiritual experiences that people have, people come to us from other synagogues and say, that's the most spiritual service I've ever been to. So we take a lot of pride in that in the Reconstruction community. But I do think that many people in our community would have a problem with the way you ascribe consciousness to God. And the way I would frame the question is this. Is your position that humans have adjusted their view about God because of the events of human history, most notably the Shoah? Or are you suggesting that God, responding to the tragedy of the Holocaust, chose to throw out his old playbook and adopt a new one? Those are two very different
No,
theories. And I'm wondering which you're trying to say.
no, it's neither. I'm saying that the divine has been divine. God is a great educator and a loving parent. As a parent, a loving parent, as you're a teacher, you teach the child an ability in accordance with their ability to understand. So in the first stage, yes, they needed reward and punishment because all the other gods around them were offering rewards and punishments. They need, in the first stage, voices from heaven and miracles that impress them. But in the end, that's an immature form of relationship, an immature form of religion. You're doing it basically because you're getting paid. It's like a child who does it for the candy. Okay, it was appropriate, but after 1,000 years or 2,000 years of training people to right and wrong, to ethical responsibility, with the argument being, reward and punishment, and God expects this from you. In the second stage, when they're more mature, that's what the rabbinic stage is about. When people don't need reward and punishment, they are much more conscious of the substance and of the presence of the divine and of the rightness of the divine, ethics. So I'm saying it's not because God gave up or the behavior, it's that the divine as a teacher moves to the second stage. Now, why do I say God is infinite consciousness? I'm speaking now of the Tehillim. It's a prayer we say every day in the warm-up before the Shema. It says, Monem ispar lakochavim. God counts all the stars. The Chulam has a name for each one. Well, of course, there are infinite numbers of stars. So human consciousness cannot encompass all the stars, let alone have a name for each one. But what happens? The divine, and so in a sense, what the psalm is trying to say is that the God is infinite consciousness. Again, it's human terminology, so take it with a grain of salt. But it means that everything I do, and none of my suffering is lost or wasted. At least this is the equivalent in the pre-modern stage, Hashgacha Pratit. God, everything that happens in my life is God's personal guidance based on my behavior to me. But I think God has deliberately not done that anymore, precisely because then they would have no freedom. You'd be Pavlovian dogs. You do the right thing, you get a reward. You do the wrong thing, you get punished. So when I fall off a cliff, whether it's an evil man or a good man, the law of gravity smashes me to the ground. So the divine has done that, I believe, to give humans freedom and to respect their dignity and to allow them freedom of choice. On the other hand, the divine has given us, so that's the infinite consciousness, that whatever I do, whatever I say, whatever I suffer, is not lost and disappears, at least as a divine. Now, the rabbis, again, trying to minimize reward and punishment and that kind of thing, came up with this idea. Don't be a servant, this isn't ethics of fathers. Don't be like servants who serve the master for the sake of reward. Be like servants who serve the master for its own purpose, for the purpose. So the rabbis were moving us in that direction, to give up and do it. I always joke about it. The rabbis stress the world to come. The Bible doesn't at all. I said, but you know what that's like? That's known as the discounted value of capital. When I give you $1 million right now, it's worth $1 million. If I give you $1 million 10 years from now, it's only worth 100,000 because you won't get there till then. So by telling us the rewards in the world to come, they're really telling us that the reward is much less of a factor, much less of a weight. And that's trying to teach us that was something. And I'm arguing we are now in the highest level of religious. Again, many people have chosen to interpret God's absolute non-visibility as God is not there, and human responsibility, meaning humans are in charge. But if you look at it from the religious perspective, the divine perspective, not that God gave up after the Holocaust, is that God had already passed the control, the agency of humans covenantally to humans. And humans, unfortunately, the Nazis used that freedom to create an extermination machine. The Allies had power, but they didn't use it to save Jews. And the Jews didn't have power. That'll bring us to your third question. That's why they couldn't find refuge. They couldn't stop the Nazis. And so in the end, 6 million were killed. Actually, that's my point. The whole Jewish people woke up after the Holocaust and realized the message of modernity, that we have to take power to protect ourselves. And you know what? The Holocaust had its impact throughout the whole world. It wasn't just the Jews who woke up to that. That's why the post-war anti-imperialist colonial revolts. They understand that the white man, even when he brought many blessings of civilization, will not look out for you. You have to have your own people. In the first stage, their own people were worse than they are whites in many places, like Uganda. But it doesn't matter. We have to take responsibility. Women's liberation happens after World War II. Same reason. No matter Jewish husbands are known to be kind and good. Okay, but you know what? My dignity shouldn't depend on my Jewish husband being kind and good. You have to create power that women can have. Gay liberation. So that's what we're talking about here. And the Jewish people, in my judgment, understood that, and that's what the state of Israel is about. And it raises the question of how do we use this power once we get it? It's a fair question. But the heart of what I'm trying to say.
Let me just stop you before you go there, because I want to just frame it in a certain way. I just want to mention that I'm having my own experience of the juxtaposition of hiddenness and closeness. The only way we got this interview to work is that I've been sent to time out in the children's quiet room. So I'm behind the entire audience right now, where I don't have the overlay, but I see everything happening. So this is kind of the hiddenness closest, right?
Okay.
I'm not even in the room, but at least thankfully people can hear this beautiful interview. So thank you again. So it takes me to the last section that I want to talk about, and that is Israel and also Judaism in the Third Era. Yes, you're speaking to us from your home in Jerusalem. I know you have a deep love for the state of Israel. It's a love that I share. Although I don't own a home in Israel, our daughter lives there, and every time I visit, I'm overwhelmed by love for all that Israel represents. My history, my people, my culture, and the Jewish people's collective future. You use Israel to represent the Jewish people's life-affirming response to their near annihilation during the Shoah.
Right.
Now, in 1988, in the midst of the First Intifada, you published one of your most important essays called The Ethics of Jewish Power, which I've read many times. You argued there that the Shoah taught us that Jews had to acquire power to survive in the world. But you added, Israel's acquisition of power imposed an obligation to use that power with moral restraint, especially given the Jewish people's history of suffering and victimization throughout history. Today, Israel is ruled by a government led by Bibi Netanyahu that includes cabinet members who have called for the removal of all Palestinians from Gaza. They called for the annexation of East Jerusalem and the West Bank, and who have been complicit in the daily harassment of Palestinians in the territories that includes violence, destruction of property, stealing of land, and even murder. There are estimates that just since October 7th, some 30 to 40,000 Palestinians have been driven from their farms and villages by settlers with full complicity of the Israel Defense Forces. Do you think that the current government of Israel is acting with the kind of moral restraint that you wrote about in the Ethics of Jewish Power? And if not, what would you counsel Jews who want to bring greater morality into the world? What would we do vis-a-vis Israel?
Yeah. It's a fair question, and we're all wrestling with it. Now, first of all, I got to say again, Israel is the life-affirming. I hope you said that. In fact, again, the whole theme of the book is the religion is about affirming life, living life deeply, and trying to bring the Messiah, or trying to bring the perfection of redemption, is trying to bring life to be dominant and universally upheld. That's what it's all about. So I start with that. Now, Israel, therefore, is not just taking power to protect us, which it is, and it's crucial. And in fact, since its existence, millions of Jews in danger and persecution and suffering were brought to freedom, including Ethiopian Jews, and that's a major contribution. So it goes beyond self-defense to making life possible. Also, Israel has had a remarkable life affirming a startup nation. It's a world leader. It's a world leader in irrigation. It's a world leader in medicine. It's a world leader in ways of cybersecurity, improving the world and making it more livable and human dignity. And again, Israel having taken in so many immigrants, including the Ethiopians, and giving them a life of dignity, is a statement of the use of power in the best and noblest way. That having been said, the other thing we're living with, and I've come to realize, when you take power and you get into real world history, this I didn't expect. It turns out that it brings with it all the risks of freedom. And looking back, God is our model. God self-limits. God knows that unlimited divine power humans can't live with, and the world cannot live. The world can only exist with natural law, which protects humans. It's like having too much. If you had more exposure to sun, we would all have cancer, we would die. So in other words, even the good things have to have limits in order to enable life to exist. Now, that's the background here. So my answer is, when you get involved in use of power in the real world, there are all kinds of evils that are possible just in the exercise of power. You shoot and you kill a terrorist, but there's a civilian nearby. So the test of a moral is not perfect, but keeping it down to the minimum. And Israel, I believe, has made a major effort from its beginning, even till today, to minimize civilian casualties. Now, I was devastated in the Gaza war. Estimate 70,000 dead, of which probably 25,000 or 30,000 are fighters. That means 40,000 are innocent civilians. That's devastating. 40,000 people died, and many of them are children, not as Hamas tried to propaganda say, majority of children. But it doesn't matter, even one child, let alone thousands of children. It's devastating. But the answer is, in the real world, there's no other way. You can't kill, particularly now when Hamas stations its soldiers and its fighters in civilian places, when it makes tunnels into homes and mosques and schools and community centers. So there's no way. So then the test becomes, and that's part of a mature moral responsibility. So people say, I don't want to kill innocent, I won't have an army. But if you don't have an army, everybody gets killed, all the innocents. So the answer is, you have to take responsibility, and that includes committing sins, but you keep them to a minimum. Now, the problem with this government, Israel has met that standard, in my judgment. The problem with this government is that, and again, I blame Netanyahu, I'm very disappointed in him. In order to stay in power, he took in partners. He firstly made Ben Gvir, who was a marginal nut, he made him a serious political opportunist, and he's now a significant political figure. Smotrich is an abuse of religious Zionism, but there he is. And these are people who are much more willing to justify and resort to violence and injustice to Palestinians, who would like to annex and suppress the Palestinian. And so, yes, the answer is that any Jew who believes in moral responsibility should be telling the Israeli government that they're acting wrongly, or this is wrong, or this is right, or they support the opposition, or they try to get through the civic organizations feedback on these questions. The tragedy here, and what complicates it, honestly, is that there is first of all, as Kissinger's famous line, even paranoics have real enemies. Israel has real enemies, and they have been trying for 75 years to wipe out. And Hamas, in its charter, and the Palestinians have generated, not every Palestinian is guilty of being Hamas, but the Palestinian people as a people have generated two movements. One is Hamas, which openly seeks to wipe out not only the state of Israel, but every last Jew in the world, and which abuses women and kills people off roofs and so on. But they've also generated a Palestinian Authority which is corrupt and in its own way. So the answer is, even those people like myself, and there are many in Israel, who supported two-state solution, and there were two-states solution in 1967 after the war, 80% of the Jews supported it. And there were other times in 2000 and under Barak in 2008 under Omar, Jews offered a Palestinian state. But the answer has been that the Palestinians have spent their energy trying to undermine, destroy Israel rather than build their own. From 1947 from 1967, to 1990, they controlled the West Bank. They controlled, from 1940 to 1967, 1948, 67, the Arabs controlled the West Bank, but they didn't build a state, which they should have. And because they were too busy trying to boycott and destroy the state of Israel. This is their tragedy. And now when Israel won and they were built up, and the nationalism built up as a result of Israel, in a good way, influence and model and so on, then they, tragically enough, and they Arafat, instead of becoming a statesman like Mandela, ended up trying to play the terror card even as he was recognized. So this is their tragedy, and this is our problem. And our problem, but I want to say, so there were diaspora Jews, number one, when you criticize Israel, you have to be much more conscious that it's a vicious and difficult world. And that, so if 10% of the Israelis vote for Ben Gvir, it's less than 10%, then it doesn't show that they are genocidal. It doesn't show, just as the Gaza deaths don't show that they're genocidal. It means that Israel, by tremendous effort, has killed 45,000 civilians to compare to 25,000 fighters. That's roughly 1.5, 1.6 civilians. Well, it turns out if you study military history, the average of civilians killed in any war runs to up 5 to 10. In Afghanistan, when the Allies decided to change their policies in order to win back the public against the Taliban, they put a tremendous effort into reducing civilian casualties. They got it down to 3 or 4 to 1. That was an amazing accomplishment, and they worked at it. So how did Israel get it down to 1.5 or 1.6 to 1? The answer is by working at it. And so this army, even in the most difficult and led by people who are irresponsible, or some of them are reckless, has nevertheless done a significant job. It's hard to, therefore, to simply criticize unreservedly. You know why? Because out there people are using it to label Israel genocide, to label Israel apartheid, to label Israel. You know why? Because that will pave the way for the legitimate attempt to wipe out Israel. So when you criticize, when I criticize, I have to be aware also how will my words be used or twisted by people whose goal is to undermine, destroy Israel. So it puts some limits. And again, I still think we can feedback. I still think we can nuance and tell the government, or we can try to help the opposition and so on. This is the thing. So my answer to your question is that this government is, because of the extremist influence and because Netanyahu will give them anything they want, is doing some terribly bad things. By the way, that includes internally giving the Haredim the draft exemption when they're desperately short of soldiers, and when the reservists, that's the daily people who have responsibility, spend 200, 300 days of the year fighting away from their families and so on. So they're doing bad things, and that includes mistreatment of Arabs. Ben Gvir, who was in charge of the police, has allowed and hasn't responded as they should have been, in an emergency way, to the wave of organized crime and murder in the Arab. And then, yes, the settlers' violence, and not all the settlers, doesn't matter. There's some element of settlers' violence. Instead of stepping in and cracking down and punishing, he and his influence, Smotrich is in charge of the West Bank. Under their influence, these settlers are getting away with literal murder, not typically murder, but literally murder and other things. So that's wrong. So we as Jews, I think we can say, we should say through the Jewish channels to the government how much we despise and reject and think this is a violation of Israel's morality and ethical record. We can also, I think we have to work at it, develop nuanced public criticism in a way that hopes, again, they say nuance, and you have to be very careful not to let it play into the hands of the Tucker Carlsons, or for that matter, the Palestinian allies, who use all these truths to tell a big lie.
Let me just jump in, yes, because we're really going to run out of time.
The truth is there are abuses, but it's a big lie is that the country as a whole, right? Sorry.
Look, what I would say is I think that the biggest moral question facing the Jewish people today is how you reconcile the truth that you just shared, the truth about how Israel came into being, all the contributions it's made to the world and to the Jewish people, the fact that any criticism of Israel can be used against us by people, enemies that would do us wrong and worse, okay? And yet I fear that much of the Jewish establishment, including the government of Israel, is using that as a cover for extraordinary ethical and moral violations of human rights. I want to just read to you something that was written by the head of the IDF Central Command, who's responsible for security in the West Bank. He wrote this on Friday. I just want to share this with you. It says, this is Avi Bluth, this is his name, Bluth. A violent group of lawbreakers is operating in the territory of Judea and Samaria without restraint, contrary to the law, to IDF values, and to the values of the Jewish people. Their actions are harming people in a population that is not involved in terrorism. This population has no connection to terrorism. The violent activity carried out in an organized and systematic manner threatens the rule of law and order in the region and harms the IDF's mission and undermines Israel's security. And he closes by saying the following, and I think this is written to me, to you, to everyone in this audience. Bluth says, I call upon you, state leaders, rabbis, educators, and opinion leaders, to come to your senses. Do not remain silent. Do not stand aside. Do not allow. Do not cooperate. Do not continue to turn a blind eye after the warning signs have appeared again and again and again.
God bless you. Amen to that. And thank God again. To me, it's a measure of IDF's moral stature that a central command general says this and speaks. Now, how come it happens even though a general in charge of the area is against it? The answer is in part because people are bad, and in part because they're getting help from the Ben Gvirs and the Smotriches of this world, and that is a horror. And again, I accept your point, and I think we as Jews I've certainly tried in our connections and then speaking to the government to communicate how terrible this is, and to communicate even publicly now, again, with some restraint, with some nuancing and some struggle. And I think we have to work harder at it. So I accept your point. This is probably the central moral thing. But I do want to say, on the other hand, as someone who supported a two-state solution very early and who still would like to see a two-state solution, right now it would be irresponsible and reckless to give the Palestinians a two-state, because it would be quickly turned into a terrorist state. It is already partially that way. So my answer is, in the real world, we're going to have to live with even more draining, emotional, costly struggles where you are doing the best to be ethical, but the best ethical is full of flaws and misbehaviors that aren't being stopped. It torments me, but my answer is it's part of the responsibility, and that's what Yom Kippur is about. That there is no tzaddik. That in the real world, even the best people end up getting compromised morally. Our challenge as Jews is not to be compromised any more than is strictly avoidable. and it's a struggle, and it is a struggle. And I appreciate, again, I just the rabbis who criticize Israel publicly and who criticize America, I just say how you say it and where you say it is your responsibility too. But I understand the motivation, and I understand it's part of a struggle which we're all engaged in, that we not be corrupted by power. The truth is that power corrupts. I wrote in that essay you cited, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. But absolute
I need to
powerlessness
interrupt you only. I need to interrupt
corrupts
you only
even
because
more.
we need to
And
be.
this is our challenge. We can't go back to powerlessness. We can't go back, I mean, God forbid, we can't go back to giving up the state, but that we have this unrelenting obligation to reduce and to minimize the abuse of power.
Yes, well, with apologies, we have to be out of this space in 5 minutes. So,
Okay.
but I want to end on an upbeat note and give you like 3 minutes to do a final statement. I've often said that chapter 14 in your book, The Triumph of Life, is so elegant, so inspiring. I think that someone should put Shrup to it, and we should start reading it as a haftarah at Shabbat services. It's so beautiful because it's your vision of what the third era could look like if Judaism realized its full potential. So
Yeah.
I need to give you only 3 minutes to kind of share with us just a tipa, a little drop, a hint of how you ended the book.
Yeah, well, I try to say the first one, the third era, that Judaism can become a partner with the whole world. And the Jews, no one can lift this whole world, Tikkun Olam alone. 14 million Jews aren't going to be able to perfect the world, even if they all try. But we can, in partnership with others and with God, we can try. And this is, to me, the religion is saying, choose life, affirm life, and means whatever you are. This is the beauty, it seems to me. If you're a doctor, you can save lives, but you can do a home visit. You can research miracle cures. If you're a businessman, you can create circumstances in which your workers have dignity and good salaries, and they don't pollute the environment, and you don't, waste and so on. In other words, each person in their field, there's an opportunity here to respect and uphold the image of God, the right of every human being to be treated as infinite value, as equal, and as unique. It's a chance to breakthroughs in almost every field if we use the power correctly. And again, if you're a housewife or if you are a psychiatrist, if you are a teacher or you are a sports, whatever field you're in, there's a chance to show and model how to prefer life, how to maximize life, how to minimize death. You can drive not only an electric car that doesn't pollute so much, but you can drive responsibly and carefully and save lives. In short, we have an opportunity in the third era to realize the great dreams of the Jewish people, to overcome the enemies of life, whether it's poverty, whether it's hunger, whether it's oppression, discrimination, war, sickness. These are the enemies of life. There are major breakthroughs in each field. There's also major abuses in each field. So what I tried to say in this last chapter was our religion at its best, at its worst, it has been Gvirs and people who use power to abuse. But at its best, it gives us a model of how we can, in a partnership, respect. Partnership and covenant means you compromise, you respect, you don't jam, you don't coerce. You give up the power of coercion. By education, by sharing, by experience, inspiration, by partnership, you work with others to improve life, to upgrade life. And I do believe that it's credible. It was a dream, but now it's credible. Overcoming poverty, overcoming sickness was an incredible idea, but it's now doable if you apply yourself. So this is the opportunity and the privilege of being alive in our time, that in any field that you're in, you name it, and including a rabbi, you can create community. You can share with people can have an input and insight that you never had before. You have a two-way communication power platform that you never had before. In each of these areas, you have access to the whole tradition as no one ever had before. You have women participating as never before. So all I'm saying is that in this period, if we can rise to our best, if we can filter out our best values and reject our worst tendencies, we can, as a living model, that's what I see Israel as a limited, one country limited model, but a model that can be imitated, how you take people from poverty to affluence, how you take people from Ethiopia in the 16th century to a modern urban culture. And I hope that book will inspire people who read it to see that that's possible. And I hope that Judaism will rise to this occasion. In the end, in self-defense, we develop tribalism, we develop out of human flaws, we take some of our traditions and use them to justify abuse. And yes, some people take survival and under cover of survival try to allow abuses. I think we have to have the courage and belief in our own selves to take responsibility. And that includes, as you said, taking risks in criticizing and challenging abuses. And I think we have an opportunity to the finest hour, a highest form of religion that is pluralist, that is respectful, that takes God seriously. Either version takes God seriously. And yes, Sid, part of the reason I have been so attracted to you is not just your lovely personality and charm, but that you create and you believe in this and you work at it. And I think we all can do that and we all can make a contribution.
Well, yes, let me give you a triple appreciation. First of all, for your time this morning, for the book, for a lifetime of commitment to Israel, the Jewish people, and the betterment of the world. And personally, you have been such an important teacher and mentor to me. We wish you and Blue good health, be safe. Thank you so much. Let me have the audience appreciate. We usually on Shabbat we only do with hands, but I think that we can do a clapping too as well. Thank you so much, Yitz.
Thank you for the opportunity, and thank you for taking it seriously to read it and listen to these questions. Be well.
Bye-bye.
Be well. We send our love from Jerusalem, and we pray for peace and for good Pesach and a good year.
Chag Sameach.
Okay, friends, just 1 minute, shh, if you don't mind. The good news is that I'm out of timeout now. I had a 2-hour timeout and with all the toys, the image, someone should have taken a picture of me interacting with Rabbi Yitz with toys all over the ground, you know. It was very surreal for me, but I'm glad we got this to work. I'm sorry it took so long to get it going. I want to thank all the people who made this possible. Ken Avner, my personal assistant, Debbie Weinstein, was here and had to leave, but I couldn't have done it without her because she just troubleshoots in ways that I couldn't have done. And thank you for being part of the course and part of this experience this morning. And I'd love to hear some feedback. I thought we would have like a half hour after the thing with Yitz to do a little closure for the class, but we actually do have to vacate the space. The orchestra is going to set up in here. So thank you. And if you have any thoughts or reactions to the interview or to the course, send me an email. I'd like to get some feedback because we lost that time in the tech problems. So thank you all.